ክቡራትና ክቡራን እንደምንላችሁ ይህ በቲጂ ሬዲዮና ቴሌቪዥን እየተዘጋጀ የሚቀርብላችሁ የቲጂ ቴሌቪዥን መርሃ ግብር ነው። አዘጋጅና አቅራቢ መስፍን በዙ ነኝ። ተመልካቾቻችን ኮንግረስማን ክሪስ ስሚዝ ለአብዛኞቻችሁ እንግዳም የሚሆኑ አይመስለኝም። በኢትዮጵያ ፖለቲካ ላይ ከፍተኛ ተሳትፎ የሚያደርጉና በኒው ጀርሲ የሚገኘውን የፎርዝ ኮንግሬሽናል ዲስትሪክት በመወከል በአሜሪካን ኮንግረስ ለ37 ዓመት ያህል እያገለገሉ የሚገኙ የአሜሪካ ኮንግረስ አባል ናቸው። ኮንግረስማን ክሪስ ስሚዝም በተለያየ ጊዜያት በጽህፈት ቤታቸው ኢትዮጵያን በተመለከተ ስብሰባ ማድረጋቸው ይታወሳል። በቅርብ ጊዜም ማለትም ማርች 9 2017 ዲሞክራሲ አንደር ትሬት ኢን ኢትዮጵያ በሚል ርዕስ ስብሰባ አዘጋጅቶ ነበር። በዚህም ስብሰባ ላይ ምንም እንኳን ኮንግረስማን ስሚዝ በኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ለሚደረገው ለውጥ እውቅና ቢሰጡም አብዛኛውን ጊዜ የፈጁት የኢትዮጵያ መንግስትን በመቃወም ነበር። በዚህም ስብሰባ ላይ ከተለያዩ ቦታ የተጋበዙ በመንግስት ላይ ያላቸውን ተቃውሞ ለማሰማት ንግግር አድርገዋል። ነገር ግን ከመንግስት ደጋፊዎች ዘንድ በዚህ ስብሰባ ላይ ንግግር እንዲያደርጉ የተጋበዙ አልነበሩም። ኮንግረስማን ክሪስ ስሚዝም በኢትዮጵያ ላይ በደንብ በማተኮራቸው ቃለ መጠይቅ እንዳደርግላቸው ጥያቄ ባቀረብኩት መሰረት ፈቃደኛ በመሆን ከኮንግረስማን ስሚዝ ጋር ተቀምጬ ነበር። በዚህም ቃለ መጠይቅ ላይ የቲጂ ቴሌቪዥን ተባባሪ የሆነው አቶ ደስታ አላባውም ተገኝቶ ነበር። እሳቸውንም ለመጠየቅ የተሰጠን ጊዜ ግማሽ ሰዓት ብቻ ስለነበረና እንዲሁም አቶ ክሪስ ስሚዝ ለምንጠይቃቸው ጥያቄ መልስ የሚሰጡት ረዘም ያለ ስለነበር የያዝናቸውን ጥያቄዎች በሙሉ ለመጠየቅ እድል አላገኘንም። አብዛኛውን ጊዜ የሚናገሩትም ልክ ተቃዋሚዎቹ እንደሚናገሩት የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ይገላል፣ ያስራል የሚል ነው። በተለይ የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት በድርቅ ለተጎዱት ወገኖቻችን ምግብ ከማቅረቡ በፊት የመንግስት ደጋፊ እነዚህ ምግብ የሚፈልጉት ወገኖቻችን የመንግስት ደጋፊ መሆናቸውን መንግስት ማረጋገጥ አለበት ሲሉኝ እኔም ይህ መረጃ ትክክል አይደለም ስላቸው መረጃ አቅርብልኝ የሚል መልስ ነበር የሰጡኝ። ተመልካቾቻችን ከኮንግረስ ክሪስ ስሚዝ ጋር ስለነበረን ቆይታ ብዙ በመናገር ጊዜ አላጠፋም። ይህንንም ከኮንግረስማን ክሪስ ስሚዝ ጋር ያደረግነውን ቆይታ እንዳለ አቅርበዋለሁ። ከዛም በሀገራችሁ ጉዳይ ላይ ለኮንግረስማን ክሪስ ስሚዝ የምታቀርቡት ጥያቄ ካለ በተለመደው ስልክ ቁጥር በ703 688 2398 ደውሉልኝ። በዚህም አጋጣሚም I sincerely thank Congressman Chris Smith for giving us the opportunity to sit down with him. ተመልካቾቻችን ለኮንግረስማን ስሚዝም ቃለ መጠይቅ ያደረግንላቸው በካፒታል ሂል በሚገኘው ቢሮአቸው በመገኘት ነው። ቢሮአቸውም ይዘን የሄድነው እቃ እንዳለ ስቱዲዮን ማለት ነው ይቻላል። የቴሌቪዥን ስቱዲዮ እቃ በጣም ከባድ ስራ ነበር። ተመልካቾቻችን ከኮንግረስ ክሪስ ስሚዝ ጋር ያደረግነውን ቃለ መጠይቅ እንድትከታተሉ በትህትና እጋብዛለሁ። ይህ ቲጂ ቴሌቪዥን ነው። አዘጋጅና አቅራቢ መስፍን በዙ ነኝ። ወደ ቃለ መጠይቁ። በዛሬውም ዝግጅት የቲጂ ቴሌቪዥን ተባባሪ የሆነው አቶ ደስታ አላቦ ከኛ ጋር ይገኛል። እንግዲህ የኢትዮጵያን ጉዳይ በተመለከተ ጥያቄ እንድናቀርብላቸው በጠየቁት መሰረት ኮንግረስማን ስሚዝ ፈቃደኛ ሆነው ይህ ቃለ መጠይቅ ልናደርግላቸው ይሄው እኔና ደስታ አላቦ በእሳቸው ቢሮ እንገኛለን። ኮንግረስማን thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to meet us today.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And then in Amharic we say amasagnalo.
And welcome to Washington, D.C. Welcome to my office.
Thank you very much. Congressman is elected in 1980 and you were 27. Am I correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
And he serves the residents of the 4th Congressional District of New Jersey. Mr. Smith serves as a senior member on the Foreign Affairs Committee and is chairman of its Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights and International Organization Subcommittee. He is co-chairman and the highest ranking House member of both the bipartisan House-Senate Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe and the bipartisan House-Senate-White House Congressional Executive Commission on China. He also served as a special representative on human trafficking for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Previously, Congressman served as the chairman of the Veterans Committee 2 terms and chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Human Rights and International Operation and the Subcommittee on Africa. Congressman Smith also conducted hearings in the past concerning Ethiopia. And that's why we requested an interview with Congressman Smith. Once again, I thank you so very much for giving us the opportunity to sit down with you. Before I go to the question, let's start with your opening statements or comments to our Ethiopian audience and listeners. Thank you.
Well, let me just say how grateful I am for the leadership of the Ethiopian people. They have shown a remarkable resilience, having gone through many crises. I remember during the 1980s, during the Mengistu regime, when sadly food was used as a weapon, and so many Ethiopian people not only survived, but they overcame a famine that was made worse by it was man-made to some extent, but also, of course, it was dictated by nature. And that's when I really got involved with Ethiopia during the famines that occurred there. And I've worked on human rights around the world for the entirety of my 37 years as a member of Congress. Religious freedom, against torture, because I think torture is one of the most heinous practices on the face of the earth. And yet in many places it's practiced routinely. You mentioned the China Commission. We just put out our China Commission report, and torture has gone from bad to worse under the Xi Jinping regime in Beijing. So, we push aggressively against that. I've written a lot of laws. I think you may know some of them. A few of those laws, 4 of them have to do with the barbaric practice of human trafficking, which is modern day slavery, sex and labor trafficking. And I wrote the landmark law called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act 2000, which seeks to employ the 3 mutually reinforcing P's, as we call it: prevention, prosecution of the traffickers, and protection for the victims, especially the women who are treated like chattel slaves and forced into commercial sexual activity, forced prostitution. And I wrote that law. And what it does, it looks at not just the United States, because it applies here, but applies globally in a way that says to every country, there are no borders when it comes to trafficking. Traffickers go across borders, inside borders, and they destroy women and children and vulnerable populations. And so every year there's what we call the TIP report that comes out pursuant to my law. And every country is analyzed as to how well they're doing or not when it comes to human trafficking. And there's sanctions if a country is found to be an egregious violator. So I work on all of these issues. I've actually written 4 laws on torture victims, known as the Torture Victims Protection Act. And that's about helping people with post-traumatic stress injury, as well as the physical injuries that they carry into their lives because they have been beaten, cattle prods have been applied to them, chemicals have been used to warp their minds. The Soviets perfected that, as did the North Koreans, through psychiatric prisons. The Chinese use it as well. So that's a major problem. Torture is one of the most heinous practices on the face of the earth. My Torture Victims Relief Act tries to help the victims of torture. And in this country alone, there are about 500,000 people who have come here, sought asylum here, who have been tortured. So we have a large diaspora of all nationalities and races who get help because of that law and the best practices that it has promulgated. So I work, and on the humanitarian side, and I think you know this, we work overtime to try to mitigate the issue of HIV/AIDS, malaria, infectious diseases like tuberculosis, which is now the leading killer infectious disease killer in the world. I've been to Ethiopia a number of times along with Greg Simpkins, my chief of staff, and other countries in Africa, pushing neglected tropical disease mitigation. 1.4 billion people walk around with worms and parasites, and for pennies, we already have a program, but we have a new bill that would take it to the next level to eradicate these neglected tropical diseases. Ebola broke out, we all know, last year, but there are all kinds of diseases that get far too little attention by the international community. So our new bill, and Greg Simpkins and I have worked on this bill. We got it passed in the committee last year, but not a law. This year we're determined to help those people who are carrying these terrible diseases and parasites and worms. We also work on food aid. And finally, and I could go on, but one of the ones that we're most proud of is promoting the whole idea of the first 1,000 days of life from conception to the second birthday, which has an enormous amount of morbidity and mortality for children and for mothers, who give birth. And if you want to reduce maternal mortality and have stronger children with good immune systems, make sure that prenatal care, good nutritional supplementation occurs, best birthing practices at birth, so that the neonates can live, the newborns can live. And if you do that in the first 1,000 days, the next 25,000, or ever how long that individual is on Earth, their lives will be stronger, their cognitive abilities will be better because they won't have stunting and other issues. So we're pushing the first 1,000 days everywhere, including Ethiopia and throughout Africa.
Thanks so very much, Congressman Smith. And let's talk about yesterday's hearing. You had a hearing yesterday on Ethiopian. Could you tell me briefly what's the purpose of the hearing yesterday?
The purpose is to bring additional light and scrutiny on a deteriorating human rights situation in Ethiopia. It is to appeal to the government to stop its political prisoners' incarceration, to let people out. Very often under the guise of anti-terrorism laws, and this is a problem in other countries as well, people who just disagree or protest without violence are scooped up, put into prison, and maltreated because they have a different opinion. That's not terrorism, and those people should not be in prison. I know that some have been allowed out, and that's a good step, but many more, the estimates that we see are about 10,000. That has to end. Greg Simpkins, my chief of staff, and I, in 2005, traveled to Addis to meet with President Meles after there were serious reports of people being gunned down, opposition party people being incarcerated, simply because of the elections, and that the elections were egregiously flawed. They were not free and fair. So we went there, we met with the president, we met with others, and I came away even more determined. As a matter of fact, when we got on the plane, I sat down and started writing out what became known as the Ethiopia Human Rights Act. Greg and I worked on it for several weeks and months. We introduced it, and it established benchmarks based on universally recognized human rights standards, not American values, although they are American values, but they're universal values to which Ethiopia has agreed as part of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and other important international covenants to which they have acceded to. And we wrote this, introduced it. Don Payne, who was then my ranking member, and I together worked on it, and then 2 years later, he introduced a similar version, and we worked on his. And it has one thing in mind, making sure that people in Ethiopia, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of where they live, are treated with profound respect and are not abused in any way under the guise of anti-terror or any other reason. And we also simultaneously have worked very hard to get humanitarian aid and healthcare aid to Ethiopia, and the U.S. commitment to Ethiopia is very, very serious. Over the last 3 years into this year, we're talking over $600 million. There's a commitment on the part of the American taxpayer and the U.S. Congress and the President to help those who are weak, fragile, and need help, because we have them too, and our government resources goes there too, domestically. But our hope is that the human rights situation will matriculate to protection from where it is now, which is a lack of it. So from 2005 on, after that election, we've been keeping even more of a light and scrutiny on Ethiopian human rights. We don't just trust and look at what we find, although we do trust it. The U.S. Department of State does an annual report on human rights called the Country Reports on Human Rights Practices. It just came out last week, and it paints a very serious picture of human rights abuse in Ethiopia. And that's done by the U.S. Department of State. Then we hear from groups like Human Rights Watch, which we had one of their witnesses yesterday present powerful testimony about human rights abuse. As a matter of fact, he brought up something that I found very, and I'm going to follow up on this, that in order to get food and humanitarian assistance, people have to pledge themselves to the government and not be in opposition to the government. Well, since a lot of that money is U.S. funding, and a lot of it is international funding coming from the European Union and elsewhere, we have an obligation to make sure that if somebody is sick or hungry, it doesn't matter what your politics are and whether or not the government likes you, that aid has to flow to that family and to those communities. So we're going to double down on that and look at that even more pursuant to the testimony we received yesterday. So the hearing was designed to bring scrutiny, a spotlight. We have a resolution pending that would put the whole Congress on record of expressing our concern. I'm hoping for reform from within. You know, friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. And if there's a problem, we do it here in this country. When there's a civil rights problem or a state has a law that is out of sync with international norms, we have ways of conditioning United States funds to that state. We did it with women's in sports, for example, or women's equality, to make sure that if you receive federal funds to a college, for example, you can't have a discriminatory policy towards women and to the girls if they're younger than, and that has had an incredibly positive impact on saying equality, we mean it. You know, male or female, you're equal before the law. And I think the same applies, I know the same applies to ethnicities and to races. And we've had our own civil rights struggles here. And thankfully, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and so many other important laws over the years, we're always striving to be fairer, to treat people with greater respect, not less. And it's a process. You know, you don't get there overnight. And our hope is with Ethiopia that the government will realize in Addis that we're not kidding. Human rights matter. And I know you're partners with us on peacekeeping and with the African Union especially. I mentioned yesterday in my opening comments how grateful we are to the government for its deployment of peacekeepers in hotspots in Africa especially. But the flip side of that is treat the people within Ethiopia with profound respect and universally recognize human rights.
I completely agree, Congressman, with the human rights respect in Ethiopia. But there are also some wrong information about the food distribution, which I find it incorrect. Because if you remember, last year Ethiopia faced the worst drought in 50 years, and the government and its people are managed to avert the crisis. And let me ask you a question.
Well, again, on that.
I will go.
We are going to follow up on
that's not my
testimony
question.
Yesterday.
That's not my question, Mr.
From Human Rights Watch, which I thought was...
You can answer that question. Let me ask him and I'll follow up with the question. Congressman, during your speech yesterday, I quote, You said, have discussed with the government of Ethiopia the possibility of working cooperatively to find ways to end the repression without creating a chaotic transition. That's why you said in an opening statement. But in order to find a solution, when was the last time you meet with Ethiopian officials to discuss about the human rights issue and any other issue in the country?
Well, my staff, it's ongoing. We are going to meet with the ambassador soon. I wanted to have the hearing first. I'm going to follow it up with, before we bring the bill to the floor, have a conversation with the ambassador. And so there's a give and take between us, and Greg Simpkins has been in contact with the embassy as well. But again, we're not looking for meetings for meeting's sake. We're looking for deeds. It's all about the performance of the government, and we have multiple, and I mean multiple, avenues of information, starting with our own embassy in Addis Ababa, and we do rely on them for fact-finding and gathering of facts. And then we look at NGOs like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and others who have people on the ground, and journalists who bring information forward. I mean, the fact that there was heavy criticism yesterday against the government for imprisoning and incarcerating journalists. We work with Reporters Without Borders and other journalist organizations that try to protect journalists. I mean, I don't like what the press writes about me sometimes, but that's the price of freedom. You know, they can criticize. And, you know, I get to write an op-ed or I get to do something in response, but you shouldn't put people in jail for that. Or same way with bloggers, same way with others who are trying to. Now, you may disagree with the content of what they say, but unless it is an incitement to violence, and unless it is, you know, when people cross the line and they commit violence, that's when any reasonable government has to step in and stop it. But when you don't like that they're criticizing the Prime Minister or anybody else on human rights grounds, that's not.
Yeah, how can you prove, Congressman? That's exactly what the Ethiopian government say. The Ethiopian government say, no, we never put journalists in jail because of what they write. What they said is they cross the line. They incite violence. They are cooperating with other organizations like considered a terrorist organization by Ethiopian government. Every time when the journalist in jail, the government is saying that, no, this journalist crossed the line. How can you prove that?
Well, again, we look to groups that have impeccable track records of speaking truth to power wherever that country happens to be in the planet, whatever continent. And the NGOs that deal with human rights do create or develop a credibility issue that when they say it, they usually can back it up with facts, and they do. They do reports. The UN special representatives, you know, I think they should have unfettered access to Ethiopia to go and do their fact-finding information. And it was pointed out yesterday that many of them have been inhibited from doing their work. And welcome, throw the doors wide open and let them come in. You know, I remember a little object lesson I learned in the early 1980s in the Soviet Union. I wanted to get to Perm Camp 35, which was where many of the highest ranking political and religious prisoners were sent in Perm Oblast, 1,000 miles away from Moscow in the Ural Mountains. I met with the Procurator General of the Soviet Union, who said, we have nothing to hide, you can come. So it took me 2 years to get there, but I did get there. We videotaped most of the prisoners, got a lot of them out because of the representation we made for them. But it was the most godforsaken place you could ever imagine. And the great Natan Sharansky was there. He had just been let out before I got there, along with Frank Wolf, another congressman. And it was like, it was a gulag. But it took 2 years to get there. Let these fact finders to have unfettered access without retaliation and prove the case that none of this is happening. And that's how you get clean, you know, transparency is the key unless there is something to hide. And in the case of the Soviet Union, I'll never forget it. There were a lot of people who didn't want us there. And it was an embarrassment to them when we ourselves saw what was going on there. It was a concentration camp. And, but they closed it eventually. You know, under Gorbachev, they began the glasnost process, and they did close it God forbid, it was like it was a concentration camp.
Mr. Labo, your next question, please.
Yes, my question goes to what's the people of Ethiopia or the community around this area, not the opposition, those who support the opposition, talk about. There are so many countries who are abusing democracy, abusing human rights.
Right.
And what is the reason that your focus is on Ethiopia, which the country is in tremendous development, building democracy, and human rights handling is far better than other countries, starting from 1991. But they say that his focus is all the time on Ethiopia. There are 187 countries or more countries in the world. But what we see is Congressman Chris Smith all the time focused on Ethiopia. Why?
Well,
and at the same time,
when they say that, whoever says it, it's very misguided. I've had about almost 500 congressional hearings that I've chaired over the years. I don't have the exact number, but order of magnitude. I've had 62 of them on human rights abuses in China. 62. I've been there. I've written legislation on human rights abuses in China. I've had them on North Korea, Vietnam, Azerbaijan, countries throughout Africa. We've had them on the DR Congo, especially on the trafficking of women there in DR Congo. We've had several on Rwanda. We've had them on virtually everyone, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, name the country. We probably have had several congressional hearings and probes backed up by legislation designed to promote a human rights policy. 3 times in the last 6 years, 8 years, I've had the Vietnam Human Rights Act pass the House of Representatives. Because in Vietnam, there is a serious deterioration of religious freedom and the increased use of things like torture. China, we just had a hearing last week on China. I co-chair the China Commission, and at one of the hearings, we actually had several of the dissidents who had spent time in the prisons give their testimony, and that one was in December, and it was riveting beyond words to hear them tell about how they were tortured, deprived of sleep, fed all kinds of drugs, and then some of their compatriots were killed by the use of torture. Whether they be Falun Gong, Christians, Tibetans, or Uyghurs, they were maltreated. Belarus, I wrote the Belarus Democracy Act, which denies visas to those who have committed human rights abuse, like Lukashenko, the president there, and I have met with him in Minsk. In Russia, I'm the House sponsor of the Magnitsky Act, which implies personal sanctions and visa denial to those who commit atrocities in Russia. We now have made that global, and it's called the Global Magnitsky Act, and I'm the House sponsor of that new law that was signed into law at the end of last year. I mentioned trafficking. You know, we've had one trafficking hearing after another with focuses on countries that have the worst records. And there are a number of them, some in Africa, some in some of the other countries of the world. So, you know, when somebody says that, they're missing by miles the consistent attitude of me, my very professional staff, led by Greg Simpkins and Piero Tozzi, and others on our staff, to make sure that we comb the world trying to help the weakest, the most vulnerable, those who are being tortured. Man, I have zero tolerance on torture. So I've written 4 laws on torture, and to help especially those that walk around with the wounds of torture, which are often right up there, psychological, inability to sleep, nightmares that just never go away as cattle prods are put on their genitals or under their arms or under their tongue or elsewhere. That goes on in Ethiopia. It goes on in a lot of other African countries. It goes on in Eritrea. And we've had the hearings. We had a hearing on Eritrea last year. A very, very important hearing on human rights abuse in that country. So we've had, I think, the most consistent policy imaginable of saying wherever there's human rights abuse, we're going to do our level best to help those who are suffering, the victims and their families. Because, you know, when a political prisoner is languishing in the prison and being tortured, the rest of the family suffers. I had one hearing on China called the 5 Daughters Hearing. We had 5 daughters of dissidents, including Gao Zhejiang, who's the leading human rights lawyer in China, who are being tortured horribly. And each of these 5 young Chinese daughters gave riveting testimony, appealing to Obama, he didn't do anything sadly, appealing to the global community, appealing to Xi Jinping, and before him, Hu Jintao, the former premier of China, pleading with them to let their fathers go. Now, that wasn't Ethiopia, that was China. Because I believe in a consistent, I've had hearings on Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, where human rights abuses. I was in a prison camp called the Palomasaro prison in Peru, not Peru, in Bolivia. I've also been to Peru on human rights issues. But in Bolivia, where, you know, inmates run the prison. There's no human rights there. And so our attitude has been consistent. And we have, I think, as a committee, the track record to say, just look at the hearings. I'll give you a copy of the hearings to take a look at. And Ethiopia, the Ethiopians are a proud people, a good people, and they deserve better than human rights abuse. They deserve total respect. And that's what we're trying to do. Yes. When we were there in 2005, when Greg Simpkins left, we went in different directions. He went with some of the opposition party people, and we met with the government too, so we meet with everybody. They were followed everywhere they went. They stopped, they looked back, and there was the secret police following them. Now, that was with a member of my staff in the car with them, and they knew that because we left President Mellis's compound, his office, where we had a rather lengthy meeting. So, we focus on all the countries and Ethiopia as well.
We understand, and the people who are supporting Ginbot Sabat, the violent opposition groups like Ginbot Sabat and OLF, they associate you with them, and they say that Congressman Chris Smith is our hero.
Well, people who are for nonviolence, they're the ones that I am in solidarity with.
Let me add a question. You remember a few years ago you invited Professor Brahanu Nagga, who is the leader of Ginbot Sabat. Ginbot Sabat declared war, decided
and
to...
we disagree with that. I disagree with that. My staff and I disagree with that. But let me just say this. I disagree with them. Violence is never the means to an end. But having said that, the government has to cease its violence. They're the government. They have the troops. They have the police. They have the justice apparatus to incarcerate. They have the prisons. They have to cease their violence. That's why we're going to bring up that bill. And I hope that, all I want is reform. We're talking about reform from within and let the people decide through free and fair elections what government they want. Every vote counts. People can sign up, get on the rolls, and with unfettered access to the polling so that they're not intimidated to vote one way or the other. Again, what got me yesterday in that hearing was hearing Human Rights Watch say, and it was in his testimony, and they have a report that talks about it, that if you want humanitarian aid, you want to feed your family, well, you better be in good standing with the government. That's not what our humanitarian... Now, I want to check this out further, and we're going to do an Inspector General's report on that to see if that indeed is the case. And to what extent. Maybe it's isolated, I don't know that. But we want to find that out because if my family is suffering from poverty and from starvation, I don't want to have to kowtow to the government in order to get it. I should get it because I'm an Ethiopian citizen or an American citizen or any other nationality, just because I'm a human being.
Congressman, about some of the things you said, I believe that the information you have is incorrect.
Give us your information. I'd love to see it.
Please do.
That would
we'll
be
communicate with you, definitely. As you say that the government needs to listen to the Ethiopian people.
Right. But I also say if the people, through the ballot box, wants a different government, just like our government changes all the time. We go Democrat, Republican to Democrat, free and fair elections without any chicanery whatsoever. at the ballot box or in who counts them, whether or not people can get on the ballot because they're told, oh, you're not eligible. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to game the system. So we want, as does every voter and citizen, the access to the ballot box to choose who we want to lead us.
A while ago, you say that violence is never the means to an end. What do you advise to the...
There's only one government, and I advise the government to use restraint, to use persuasion that's absolutely nonviolent, because what brought us in 2005 to Addis were the reports, and when we left there, we were even more concerned than when we went there, of people having that little red dot on their head as they're killed. It was terrible. It was a human rights abuse and the killing of people in the streets. Only the government can stop that. So stop it. That's what we're saying to them. And right now we're in the beginning of a new reappraisal, new administration, of course. And I will be encouraging the Africa Bureau. And when there's an assistant secretary chosen, whoever he or she might be, we'll be obviously huddling with them to talk about African policy in general, Ethiopian policy in particular. We want to make sure that human rights are protected. That's the bottom line of what we're asking for. And frankly, it's not a heavy lift. Any government that really wants to have legitimacy and a legacy that is respected in the long term and the intermediate term, treat your people with profound respect, and that does flow. I hope that helps.
Thank you so very much for your time, but in the future, we'll come with more time, okay?
Okay,
Thank you so very much. ተመልካቾቻችን እንግዲህ እንደሰማችሁት ምናልባት የጠየቅናቸው ጥያቄዎች 2-3 ቢሆኑ ነው። አብዛኛውን ጊዜ ያው ኮንግረስማን ሲናገሩ የነበሩት አንዳንዶቻችሁም ይሄ ጥያቄ ለምን አልተጠየቀም ትሉ ይሆናል። ግን እኛ ልንጠይቀው ያስብነው ሌሎች ጥያቄዎች ነበሩ፣ ግን ጊዜ አላገኘንም። ወደፊት ግን ያው እንደገና ለመጠየቅ እንሞክራለን። ዋናው ግን ከናንተ የሚመጣው ጥያቄ ወሳኝ ነው። እንግዲህ ይሄ እሳቸው ያሉትን ሰምታችኋል። ለእሳቸው ምንድነው የምንጠይቀው? እና ይሄንን ቃለ መጠይቅ መሰረት በማድረግ ከናንተም ለኮንግረስማን የምናቀርበው ጥያቄ ካለ ደውሉም። ያው ቁጥሩን ደግመዋለሁ፣ በ703 688 2398 በመደወል ለኮንግረስማን የምናቀርበውን ጥያቄ በትልኩልን ለኛም ይረዳናል። ይህንንም ቃለ መጠይቅ በተመለከተ የሚመለከተው የመንግስት ባለስልጣን አቅርቤ ምላሽ እንዲሰጡበት አድርጋለሁ። ተመልካቾቻችን እንግዲህ ስለ ተከታተላችሁ በጣም አድርጌ አመሰግናለሁ። ያው በየሳምንቱ እሁድ በWERA LP 96.7 FM አርሊንግተን ሬዲዮ ጣቢያ ላይ ከ1 PM ጀምሮ እስከ 2 PM ድረስም የማስተላልፈውን የሬዲዮ መርሃ ግብር እንድታዳምጡ እንዲሁ በማክበር ጠይቃለሁ። የሬዲዮኑ ጣቢያ ሞገድ በማይደርስበት ቦታ ደግሞ ችግር የለም፣ ኦንላይን ላይ በመግባት በቀጥታ ማዳመጥ ትችላላችሁ። www.wera.fm ላይ የገባችሁ ማዳመጥ ትችላላችሁ። ክቡራትና ክቡራን ተመልካቾቻችን ከኔ ጋር ስለቆያችሁ በጣም አመሰግናለሁ። ይህ በቲጂ ኢትዮጵያን ሬዲዮና ቴሌቪዥን እየተዘጋጀ የሚቀርብላችሁ መርሃ ግብር ነው። አዘጋጅና አቅራቢ መስፍን በዙ ነኝ። ደህና ሁኑልኝ።